Good day, everyone. So the year is 2060, and the role of circular economies has changed. Nowadays, every circular economy starts in the home. Materials are scanned automatically with embedded UV QR codes or material identifiers inside the substances themselves. Consumers scan their packaging and are automatically credited with money to the value of the material as feedstock, which they then dispose of in these circular loop microunits just down the street. These units granulate, filamentize, and then 3D print products directly in the same device. Manufacturing using edge manufacturing concepts nearest to where the customer resides. The money that is gained is credited to them after the material is brought. At the same time, they can pick up any products that they ordered online or using their phone. They can use that product, and if they do need to replace it, they just put it back in the same bin, identified the same way, and put back to the microunits to remanufacture. Commercial enterprises in classical manufacturing will blow in injection mold their product, but then use the waste from those processes as the secondary market feedstock for replacement parts or accessories, all of which, tens to hundreds of thousands of them, are stored in the memory of 3D vending machines located in the space of just a few dozen in retail outlets like supermarkets. Users and consumers can walk up to those machines and manufacture on demand, automatically being charged to their bank account, or order online and go and collect it when it's complete. And these circular micro units, or circular microeconomies as we call them, are decentralized and distributed around the world, meaning entrepreneurs can produce products and publish it on these platforms, and it's available globally almost instantly. And you know what? That isn't 2060. That was 2024. Our circular microeconomy unit combines circularity hubs responsible for all of the recycling, remanufacturing, and recirculation with our own 3D print vending fleet, which places vending machines like that in distributed spaces to allow districts level circularity to be closed loop and retain material value in the spaces where it's sourced, while also encouraging and nurturing manufacturing ecosystems and new entrepreneur powers to manufacture by democratizing the manufacturing and the supply chain itself. Right? But what is a circular microeconomy? Now, you know that circular economies as macroeconomic concepts, which mean they talk a lot about multi-sector and national level recirculation. But realistically, that is going to prove hard to deliver. And especially in plastics, where there are 340 million tons of plastics disposed of every year. But it's not just what's in the material, it's what ended up being put into making that product in the first place. Given the amount of transportation of oil, then feedstock, then pellets, then filament, then anything else, the totality of those ancillary processes adds up to another 45 billion tons of carbon dioxide across that material's lifetime. Right? Now that is an incredible number, but that's just the first degree effect. There are second and even tertiary degree effects, third degree effects, where there is up to $1.6 trillion of this trade-related respiratory diseases from the air quality issues of transporting this stuff around or the processing of this stuff in refineries, while also missing out on potentially $30 trillion of wasted economic potential every single year. That's over 10 times UK GDP. Right? This is not a small problem. And we all know that things like boundaries are arbitrary. Fish and the climate don't have passports. And by 2100, the Earth is expected to reach 3.8 degrees of global warming, above pre-industrial levels. And we're starting to see the effects on the supply chain from that now. But before we touch this, we have to remember that while we talk about supplies and supply chains being linear, the demand for them isn't. You will eat and you will poop every single day. That means your demand is recurrent. But we've always served that recurrent demand through linear supply chains, globalized linear supply chains in this day and age. But in reality, it's all part of one system of demand. So when you align it to the demand, you align the value chain where it should be. And when we look at that today, what we see on the incoming or upstream supply chain and the downstream supply chain is a series of fragile systems that are all subject to the forces of geopolitical instability, climate change itself, and nowadays significant numbers of war. And each of those has a blast radius that has the potential to destabilize the downstream revenue from them. Right? Now, we already know that recyclers are particularly vulnerable to this, because recycling itself, the cost of recycling to councils does not cover the cost of recycling to the recycler. It's only when they sell the bales or the recycled material downstream that they gather some of that material cost back, that processing cost back, as well as hopefully get a small, but ideally not insignificant profit. But as more and more countries are starting to destabilize or ban the imports of this sort of material from recyclers in, say, the UK, what we're starting to see is a volatility in the system that potentially which was already volatile before, is getting worse. And we all remember what happened when China decided to stop taking the UK's post-consumer plastics. It fell into negative territory. So not only had you not covered your costs in processing the material, collecting and processing the material in the first place, you also now had to pay to get rid of it. It was an absolute waste of money. And as Vietnam is doing the same, this pattern will start to repeat. And this volatility has already led to the loss of significant amounts, potentially up to 15% of the UK's recycling infrastructure. Right? So the question is, how do you deal with that? Right? Well, the first thing to note is that there's a lot of waste already in the system. I don't mean waste as in the products or the items or stock. I mean waste processes within them. For example, the amount of transportation between different agents in the economy. So moving from plastic waste to manufacturing. So what we decided to do at Really Recycle was we acknowledged the existence of this stuff, took all of it, all the individual parts of it together, got rid of the waste, miniaturized each process to make it more efficient, and then cloned it across the network. Right? And doing it this way meant that the material processed in each individual area reduces its emissions footprint by 96 to 97%. Because you're not moving it anywhere. You're not taking waste from the UK and exporting it thousands of miles, only to take products from thousands of miles away and import it into here. Right? So when you start to work on systems that can that process all of it, you can then optimize and arbitrage away some of the risks associated with the degradation of that material or the contamination of that material. Because when we do 3D printing in our case, because we do additive manufacturing, we can control and over-engineer on that part of the process to deal with the contamination on this part of the process, right? So we're able to support 500 to 800 times worse quality material than conventional manufacturers can, right? And this is all pretty much unheard of anywhere in the world because that system is optimized as a whole. And you can find our products and buy our products on many household names. But probably the biggest one from the revenue generation perspective is to understand that the cost of recycling is fixed per ton at the moment. But crucially, the cost of products, if you think about the bales as products or intermediate products, are volatile. What you want to do is remove that volatility or move that volatility up beyond the point of cost so you can guarantee to get your money back, even if you process less recycling, because you're losing what is a loss-making process to you. And what we do internally is that we will be quite strict and selective about what we'll process or how much we'll process, because we'll then use the same resources to then create products and manufacture them for the downstream or upstream for others supply chain when it becomes circular. Because the way to get rid of that volatility is to transform it into something that is less volatile. And end user and end consumer products are much less volatile than the intermediate plastic bales that you're used to getting rid of. Right? So you can see that you're transforming something that would at best give you £300 a ton into something worth £72,000 per ton, as long as you can shift it. And we can shift it. So that means you're getting an enormous amount of extra value and crucially reducing the transportation costs in the meantime. So, but it's not just that benefit. The very act of us doing that means that we are automatically decontaminating conventional waste streams. Because we're taking the hard to recycle plastics or the dirty plastics, and the cleaner ones are therefore left to the conventional and classical supply chain, which improves the amount of recyclability that takes place. Just our existence can increase, in an area, can increase the recycling rate by anywhere between 2 and 10%. Though 10% so far is only rule. So these ancillary co-benefits exist in the system because of that non-linear relationship that we have with that material that exists in that source and the manufacturing that exists in that source. And crucially, this also helps with some of the social value elements of this and entrepreneurial elements within it, because it reduces the financial burden on the entrepreneur, because we can create systems and products that don't need to be paid for upfront, right? Which is completely different, a radical departure from conventional manufacturing, where to get your first batch, the combination of tooling, factory preparation, and minimum order quantity of first batch means that you've got to spend a minimum of £160,000, and typically it's over £250,000 to get your product to market. It's not cheap at all. But in our case, because people pay for product once it's sold, because we only manufacture it then, that means that they pay about 1% of that using our system. And we would be able to outstrip conventional manufacturing up to 30,000 units. Right? You've already done small-scale deployments of 3,000 units to 4,000 units. That's standard day-to-day for us. So it is entirely competitive with that process. And crucially, even logistics companies can also use our platform because they can then build out the transportation, if you like, of over-the-air edge manufacturing to edge manufacturing. Right? So a product made in one part of the world can be deployed anywhere else in the world at the touch of a button. And these closed-loop systems have really proved their worth because they are the only mechanism that beats landfill for emissions effects. And when you do it our way, those closed-loop systems remove the transportation, which in turn massively decarbonizes the system, because about 50% of almost everything is transport. And taking a look at some examples within the NHS in particular, the NHS suffers from an even worse problem than most other areas, because while all other sectors effectively dump air quality demand on the NHS's supply chain also dumps air quality demand on the NHS to the value of about £345 million a year. So when you start to think about it as closed systems, as somebody paying for it somewhere, as a systemic effect, we realize that actually moving sort of medical plastics around is probably a silly thing to do, because even recycled once, medical plastics are better quality than the virgin plastic material that's used to manufacture general everyday products. So what this means is that downcycling as a concept isn't actually valid, because the quality of the plastics that you get after the first recycling of medical plastics is better quality than the plastics elsewhere. And understanding this material degradation profile helps you understand how you can use the concepts of what are called helical economics to deliver that value, which I'll come on to later. But here you can see how our system compares to conventional circular economies in healthcare versus linear economies. Conventional circular economies typically drops the emissions by more than half, but we will drop it by significantly more than that, because our tight cycles and our ability to reuse those products in the buildings that those facilities live in is a much, much, much better way to decarbonize and also to get supplies. Because once you're doing it this way and you're generating so much revenue from it, both in savings and new revenue streams, you can afford to process waste for free. Right? It's just a no-brainer. And as I said previously, doing it this way allows you to use, say, medical plastics, and once they've been recycled, and turn them into products to fix the hospitals that you're in, or to educate the next generation of nurses and doctors. That helical economic concept, which is a rarely used and not ubiquitous model, has the greatest potential to deliver on donor economics more generally. And it's been proven time and time and time and time and time and time again. Every time. So the question is, why not now? And the answer is public procurement. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. No, but joking aside, this is probably my most offensive part of the presentation. And people who follow me on LinkedIn know I can be quite controversial in some of the views, but at least I try to back it up with some data. So the public sector in particular has a series of challenges. Right? First of all, in terms of UK GDP, the UK public sector has a direct or indirect influence on 50% of what the UK produces. It's 16% direct spend into the economy, but crucially, if you include benefits, national health service, etc., you're hitting about 50% of UK GDP being driven by public sector in its own right. We don't have a productive private sector in the same way as other countries. Not only that, both the up and downstream value chains are split two-dimensionally, basically, across departments at all levels of government, right? While at the same time, waste itself is just a local authority concern. There's no national government focus on it. So what you have is different agencies at different levels being responsible for different things. And as more and more of the maintenance of estates in public sector, or municipal estates in public sector, starts to be devolved to housing associations, less and less of it is being done by councils in the way that they can control it. In addition to that, these disconnected value chains create holes and cracks that allow for unwitting monopolies like incinerators to exist. And also, as we've seen through some very high-profile illegal dumping, it's being used to finance crime, right? Albeit that they didn't necessarily know. In addition to that, you have waste, downstream waste and upstream products being bought on different cadences. Waste is typically contracted anywhere between 5 and 35 years in length, while products are 2 to 4 years. And this creates a temporal element to the spatial counterparty of issues. And because departmental functions are misaligned with materials and resident needs, you get a misalignment of value chains as a result of it. And this is something that procurement officers and indeed grant assessors are just not skilled enough in circularity to solve. And in fact, they're being given public policy notices that then are being misappropriated by the deployment of bidding structures which are just as big and bad and bureaucratic as the tender's main bodies are, even though it's only worth maybe a seventh of the marks. So, and all of this has to take place in a context of greater risk management as instability is taking place. But we know that tenders are not the best way to evaluate businesses and suppliers to the public sector. The very act of doing that bureaucracy, just filling out the paperwork, loses 8 billion to the UK economy every single year. Right? The average cost of a bid per participant is £5,800. The money lost to the UK Treasury because of the lost taxation for unproductive work like this is £1.8 billion. Right? The average spend by an SME wanting to crack their first public contract win is £81,200 in spend. And that means that in order to get the value back from that exercise, they have to start looking at contract values of 1.14 million just to break even. Right? Otherwise, you're almost guaranteed to be losing money. This is what limits SME participation. It's the bureaucracy and the incompetence and the mistakes that take place in that process. And we see that when you understand that public procurement bans certain types of evidence, verifiable evidence, crucially, from being displayed. And it, in fact, disadvantages any form of verifying process at all. Because if you start with a general win rate of 1 in 20, and you are told to deliver evidence, and you do that, your chance of winning goes up only to 1 in 14. But if you keep exactly the same bid as you had before, and you just prettify it, that suddenly, both in language and in form, you have a 1 in 4 chance of winning. And this is what the ecosystem of grant writing businesses kind of exists for. They're the only people that win from public sector tenders because they always get paid. The minimum spend with them is 6k, and if you win it, you're asked for another 20,000, right? Or 10% of your contract value, or something like that. And that means that the amount of money that's being sent to grant writing companies who have, frankly, not that much better chance aside from delivering this, and you still have to write it yourself anyway, means that it's just sloshing around, wasting public money indirectly through ecosystems that shouldn't exist if the tenderers, the people putting together the tenders, knew how to buy properly, to buy circular, to buy in ways that are effective uses of public money. But this is also a uniquely British problem. A lot of people in the procurement space will have criticised OJU before, and now that we've left the European, they're criticising the public contract regulation. But crucially, this would only be true if the effect was uniformly distributed across all similar European economies. But the CEBR has found that this is just not the case, and it's consistently not the case. The UK comes stone dead last in all 28 European Union nations and the UK, and is also the longest to appoint a supplier. It's almost double the cost to participate. And if that was not the case, then we could legitimize what was being said. But it's clear that because of the different ways in which this affects each country, the act of procurement is itself the reason why it fails to engage. So the blocker to delivering public policy is public procurement itself. And take a look at one of the examples from an Innovate UK bid that we recently had. Now, we get at least one assessor who has no idea how to read a bid, comprehend a bid, and certainly doesn't know the concept. So the idea of expertise in that place is nonsensical. Because this one, as you can see, it takes about 110 hours to submit an Innovate UK bid. And despite what we wrote on the left, they wrote what they wrote on the right. So it's clear that they don't really understand why this is here. And there's nothing you can do to simplify that, because the nature of the system that you have to submit the bid through limits your ability to describe it. So instead of finding transformative innovation, Innovate UK, by using word limits, fundamentally disadvantages the very thing it's supposed to be looking for. And that's common across the public sector. It's ubiquitous. We have 5 or 6 years of this sort of stuff just from ourselves, never mind the submissions we've had anonymously from nobody else. So the question is, how do you fix this? Now, in the public sector, there are mechanisms that are problematic, but crucially, there are also ways to deal with it. So the first thing is to commoditize, for commodities rather, is to create a dynamic pricing system. Okay, big deal. That's not new, but include a lot for waste. Right? That means what is bought on stationery, say, or office supplies, include a lot on waste. And then what you've got to do is the vendor and the contract management teams themselves have to take control of that supply chain. The beauty of having circular supply chains is there's no such thing as a second, third, fourth tier, because ultimately it always comes back to you anyway. Right? So you have access and should have access to the entire circular range. And you can control that by using the DPS as a mechanism. Right? In addition to that, you can create much more effective meet the buyer events by, for example, workshopping, encouraging consortia building to build out your full supply chains. Once you have that list, then start looking at the requisition process. Crucially, if you are a national body, decentralize, decentralize, decentralize. Cluster hubs together to act as transfer stations, but also look at the manufacturing part of the person where you can put them. You've also got to look at trying to nurture and build the manufacturing ecosystem. Now, this has the added benefit of then increasing the Made in Britain brand globally, right? But the key thing is we're then producing locally, which reduces our dependence on international supply chains, increases our ability to control the quality because the UK has control over its own domestic affairs, but not international ones. And the third thing, apart from by cutting out those supply chains altogether. And the third thing is that it allows us to rebuild the manufacturing ecosystem that were lost over the last 50 years, and thereby increase goods productivity. You can also tie in social value and business development within that, as well as interacting with accelerators and incubators, which then allow the cutting edge innovators to participate in ways that otherwise wouldn't be possible. And crucially, all of this allows you to report across the entire value chain in real time. You don't need to wait for annual reports. You can be much more agile as an organization. You can act when you have the information, no later and no earlier. And crucially, there's a lot that's gone into this talk today. So I'm aware I'm going to have to cut it there. But crucially, if you want to catch up with me, you can do. You can ask questions on Slido. But there are my contact details. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I'm glad to take some questions for the next few minutes.